This week I saw George Takei's story about an MIT linguistic professor's lecture. In English, he said, a double negative forms a positive. However, in some languages, such as Russian, a double negative remains a negative. But there isn't a single language, not one, in which a double positive can express a negative. Someone in the back called out, "Yeah, right." This tale almost sums up my talk, the core of which is that despite all the public commentary about what teachers should do in classrooms and how that should be measured, and despite the years of training teachers must go through before entering a classroom, ultimately it is the class itself that teaches how to teach. I hate it when younger colleagues ask if they need a doctorate. I know that having it will benefit their careers, so I have to say yes. Yes, you have to get the doctorate. You have to go into debt and eat chicken livers 3 times a week for years, during which you won't take a breath that hits your diaphragm, and you will always feel like a fool and often be thought one. And you will lose all perspective because you will turn so completely to the past that you'll think you owe it everything. Nothing will quite exist except your century or area of expertise. And when you introduce friends, you will mutter afterthoughts such as, "He's 18th century and she's 20th. This disjunction between training and teaching is something Parker Palmer reflects on in The Courage to Teach. He asks, how do we know what we know? And says, if we regard truth as something handed down from authorities on high, the classroom will look like a dictatorship. I'm 16th century, so Edmund Spenser and Shakespeare were my authorities on high, and I'm quite sure I was a Renaissance dictator in my first classes. Well, I'd like to talk a little about how I shook this skewed perspective on how a classroom should function and what forces brought me to not only to my senses, but to the present, looking into the future. Along the way, I'll bring in several points Palmer makes in his exquisite book about teaching, a book that has amended what I will tell my younger colleagues about getting the doctorate. I'll say, yes, you have to get the doctorate, but first read The Courage to Teach. When I finally left Columbia, names chiseled in the facade of Butler Library came with me. Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare. Studying their work had sculpted my mind, and it was my duty to offer the same sculpting to my students. My classes were minutes measured against points I needed to make. Until the day a student mumbled on his way out of class, "I know you get this, not sure I do." Well, that wasn't supposed to happen, so I had to ask how I was failing to convey what I knew to my students. I started reading students' faces as often as my notes and felt like a whale, with eyes on either side of my head, seeing images, different images in each eye. I was getting exhausted and beginning to understand burnout because I thought I alone was responsible for the comprehension of the material. My exhaustion brought on chronic laryngitis, and one day while I was whispering my lecture, I noticed that my students were whispering back. The absurdity of this made me burst out laughing. It was then that the class combusted into what it had been all along, a bunch of individuals whose feelings were as engaged as their minds, and it dawned on me that they felt as responsible for the class as I did, and they wanted to give back to the class and to me. Because of laryngitis, I had understood what Parker Palmer meant, that when we believe a class is only for minds, we end up with minds that do not know how to feel and hearts that do not know how to think. Shades of Van Morrison. Hearts began mingling with minds in my classrooms. I loosened up and started using YouTubes rather than a series of written questions as pre-reading. For a segment about animal intelligence, I used Battle at Kruger Park, where plotting water buffalo returned en masse to the site where lions had run their baby to ground. Students are on tenterhooks about this baby. One student always grimaces and asks, "Are you a sadist, making us watch this carnage?" But the Cape buffalo, buoyed by their numbers, begin tossing the lions in the air with their horns and free their baby to hide within the herd. By then, the class is cheering about the baby and calling for blood of the lions, sparked as they now are with interest in the topic they will next read and write about. I had learned that I had to move students before I could teach them. Some years later, this lesson of synchronizing heart and mind took a new twist when I became ill with fibromyalgia, which means movement is painful and muscles become rope-like, impeding movement. It is life-changing because you see life differently as a ratio between actions and number of steps they require. Since there's no cure, I was in for the long haul and needed to find models living graciously with life-altering conditions. Soon enough, synchronicity, I had a student who had been blind since birth and had long since made peace with her condition. Her cheerfulness and quick laughter fascinated me, and while acknowledging her far more serious condition, I privately chose her as my mentor. When in lab, Mahalia had a computer with headphones, and one day she threw her headphones off and pushed her chair back, roaring with laughter. She said she wished she could see right then, because she had accidentally connected to a porn site. Not so accidentally, I thought. But I marveled at this girl whose condition might have sidelined her except for her laughter. A few days later, as I approached my office at 7 a.m., I saw Mahalia facing away toward my office door. I called over, "Look who's here." And Mahalia turned, her face bruised and her eyes swollen shut. Her boyfriend had beat her up in the night. I don't know how she made it to my office. There was protocol I was supposed to follow. I should take her to public safety and go teach my 8 o'clock class. But Mahalia had come to me in her distress, and there was no way I was leaving her. We sat together, largely in silence, until the arrival of a counselor who said he could protect her in ways I couldn't. So I reluctantly left her with him, arranging to connect with her later that day. Some weeks later, she went back to her boyfriend and no longer picked up my calls about how she was doing. Mahalia made her own choices, never knowing that she made me see that I could not teach authentically unless I acknowledged that my students were also teaching me, or that she had been my answer to Palmer's question, how can we who teach reclaim our hearts? Mahalia will always be my mentor. The circumstances of Mahalia's life and perhaps my own vulnerability caused by chronic pain opened me to realize that everyone lives in one chronic condition or other. I became more observant of life-changing conditions, especially racism, an illness in its own right. This is certainly not just an American issue, but it seems that American authors write especially well about it. So I made James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village a course reading. The final paragraph of that essay strikes me as very generous. I believe Baldwin says that Americans, black and white, are more like one another than either is like their forebears. And I think he believed that we Americans, all of us, will ourselves end racism. But if we are to do so, we must see students through to the next level of education. Dr. Uri Treisman's work in the Emerging Scholars Program in the 70s showed me how. Dr. Treisman wanted to know why some of his minority students who were highly skilled in the classroom didn't enter professions in higher mathematics. His initial solution was increased labs, but when results didn't bear this out, he took a break from his study to simply observe his students and mull over his question. Why didn't groups of minority students enter fields of higher mathematics? His answer, when it came, was more or less General Tso's chicken. He observed that Asian students, often surrounded by families, engaged in their academic lives, had both supportive cultural and academic communities. He observed many of his African American students tended to go to class in one place, but socialize in other places, which split rather than supported their energies. Dr. Treisman's seminal work has inspired the development of courses such as first-year experience, success courses for students entering college, one of which I taught this past fall. Quite a few of my students were the first in their families to go to college, and several had not been far from their New Jersey homes. I live in the Hudson River Valley, an hour and a world away from Paramus, and I wanted the kids to see the unique light of the Hudson Valley. So we had a party for them the weekend before Thanksgiving. My husband built 3 8-foot-long tables so the kids could eat side by side, and I covered the tables with new tablecloths, vases, and candles. The menu included special requests students sent home through me. My husband and I never discussed why this party was so important to us, but I found the answer in Palmer's work. Good teaching is an act of hospitality toward the young, and hospitality is always an act that benefits the host even more than the guest. The day the kids arrived, the Hudson Valley light bounced spectacularly off hay bales, and the first student who got off the bus hugged me spontaneously, which set a precedent for all the others. We had a wonderful time. We danced and sang, we lit candles, said grace, and ate well. After we ate, some of the kids formed walking groups. Those of us on the road in front of the house heard echoes of laughter from the more adventurous groups who had headed into the woods. I could still hear those echoes from the woods. And other lingering echoes about teaching long in the woods came to mind too. I had begun teaching as a dictatorial slave to my authorities on high and my century. But I had learned that those who join me in class come first, for they are the lenses through which all I have learned will pass. I had learned that I had to move students before I could teach them, and that I had to allow myself to be moved by students. I had to allow them to give back to me. That to be authentic in my teaching, I needed to acknowledge the ways they taught me. That I needed to stay with them when they were hurt, let them go when they needed to leave. Imagine them as if every one of them had an invisible, life-altering condition, for each of them did. Be a hostess for them so that they could bring pieces of themselves to me that I'd otherwise never imagine. So to my younger colleagues, yes, get the doctorate, but don't confuse matters. Whatever training you receive will be massaged into correct alignment by your students, who will undoubtedly be your real teachers. Thank you.